Hey, it's Drybear. And with the release of Diablo 4 just around the corner, today is a very important video. We're going to talk all about game stats and character stats. You understand what goes into making your character work the way it does, understanding the stats that show up on your items so that you can customize your build. And you can also understand when you watch a build guide or read a build, you know why those stats are comprised the way that they are. And so you go into the launch day ready and raring to go. But first, you should come hang out with me on my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you don't come hang out with me and my community, then the next 5 items that drop will be just N-1, the maximum stat that it could be. So you're just that far off from being perfect. All right, let's get into it because we've got a lot to cover here. I'm going to try and structure this in a way that focuses on the higher level of the tree, and we work down towards the more nuanced stats, but it helps comprise what all of stats are in Diablo 4 because there are some stats that you've seen before. There's some of them that are implemented in a brand new way, but there's also some brand new stats that we don't really see in other games that you're gonna want to understand. And let's start at the very basic level. Your 4 main stats are going to be listed on your character sheet, and every character has them. And that is strength, intelligence, willpower, and dexterity. At first, there is a baseline of what each of these stats provide for everyone. But it gets a little more complicated because depending on what class you are, even though every character has all 4 of these stats, the class you are changes what extra value you get from each individual stat. At base, strength gives every character in the game bonus armor. However, if you are a barbarian, your strength will scale your skill damage, and if you're a rogue, your strength will scale your resource generation. So your main stat per character changes, but everyone will get armor from strength. By default, intelligence gives every character in the game resistance to all elements. More intelligence means more resistances. If you are a sorcerer or a necromancer, intelligence will also scale your skill damage. As you can see on screen, I'm on my sorceress right now. The intelligence is also scaling my skill damage in addition to adding resistance to all elements. Also, if you're a rogue, intelligence will give you crit chance. And if you're a druid, intelligence will give you resource generation. Willpower by default for all characters scales up your healing received and also scales your overpowered damage by a percentage. So that's for all characters in general. For Barbarian, Sorcerer, and Necromancer, willpower will also scale your resource generation for your subsequent resource for each of the classes. But willpower is also the primary stat for Druids, so Druids will actually get skill damage off of willpower. By default, Dexterity gives every character dodge chance. For Druids, Necromancers, and Sorceresses, your dexterity will also give you critical strike chance, as well as for barbarians. So 4 of the 5 classes in the game will get their crit chance from dexterity, but that is not the case for rogues, as dexterity is their primary stat. They get their crit chance from intelligence, and instead from crit, they get scalars for their skill damage from dexterity, as dexterity is the primary statistic for rogues. Stemming off of these primary statistics, we're gonna have some offensive, some defensive, and some utilitarian statistics. The 3 that they show on your main character sheet that are your most important are attack power, armor, and life. For attack power, it is an overall estimation of the damage they deal. It's the number that you like to see go up when you make your gear better or you make your build better. It's a combination of all of your offensive stats put together and the base weapon damage of the weapon you're currently holding and how fast it attacks. So it's a rough estimation. It's not always 100% attack power go up, I do more damn. It's just kind of like an estimation of like, hey, this is generally how strong I am. And it kind of helps you see that your character is getting stronger. Armor, as we talked about, comes from your strength for all characters. And it is just a physical damage reduction scalar. It's just a DR that scales down the physical damage that you take based on all the armor that you get. Primarily, you'll get armor from strength and from your armor pieces. Your actual gear will have flat armor on them, and there's other ways to increase it as well. And for magical damage taken, it is a total of your armor contribution plus a ton of other things. There's plenty of ways that you can reduce your magic damage taken as a global scalar outside of just per element resistance. Max life is a flat integer value that is a sum of many different sources. Gems, pieces of gear, paragon, skill points, skill trees, all that. It is an actual number that scales some of your healing effects and your potion as well, and comes from many sources, and there's ways to increase it throughout your entire build. There's a button on your character sheet, materials and stats. You hit this button and it'll expand out into more of your stats. These are the nitty-gritty niche stats that you can read up on if you're ever curious. They're not your main stats that summarize your character, but they're all quite valuable. And as you get better at making builds and implementing builds, you'll want to look at these stats. So let's quickly run through all of them so at least you know what they're all about. Every time you level up, you will get all 4 of the core stats increasing. It will also increase your base life, which is a scalar for any max life percent increases as well. And up until 50, you'll get skill points, and then you'll start for every level after that, getting multiple paragon points that you can spend. It also is a calculator of effectiveness between you and the enemy you're hitting. If you out-level them, there are scalars that bring that effectiveness of them hitting you down, and vice versa. So if you're max level and you're hitting something that's over max level, it will be a little bit harder, but that's what level does for you overall. We already talked about the 4 main stats, but weapon damage can be viewed in here, and you can see already that the number on screen for my Sorceress is different for attack power than it is for weapon damage. So again, that attack power number is a combination of many statistics, but this weapon damage comes from your currently equipped weapon, and the attack values go into this, as well as the attack speed is used as a modifier for that as well. Your weapons will have an attack speed on them, or a weapon speed, which you can view. If it's a one-handed weapon, it treats that attack speed and weapon damage differently than if it's a two-handed weapon. But if you have extra modifiers that increase your attack speed, you can go into your materials and stats and see your actual weapon speed value, which is right here on the sheet. Crit chance is your chance for a skill to trigger one of the many procs in this game, which is pretty common in all RPGs, and that is a critical strike. You can either hit a target and deal direct damage, or you can hit a target and critically strike based on your crit chance, or chance to critically strike, and then the damage that you deal is scaled, in that case, by your critical strike damage, which is the second stat listed here. So crit chance is your chance to trigger a critical. Crit damage is how much more damage it will deal when you deal a critical. Keep in mind that damage over time effects cannot cause a critical strike, and this crit damage is capped for PvP and has a base value that you can scale up with gear and paragon and skills. Overpower is a new mechanic for the game, and I'll have a separate video going through what overpower actually is. But essentially what this does is it eliminates the prevalence of glass cannon builds in endgame play. What Blizzard has been trying to accomplish with this stat is to give you more build variety. The lucky hit chance and the overpower chance means that you can build a tanky build and still clear. You can build a proc chance build and still clear. And you can build a pure damage build and still clear. And they're trying to give you more avenues for gameplay. Overpower chance at base is 3% for all classes. And this is your chance. You can think of it as like a mega crit overall. So you basically, unlike crit, you have a chance to overpower. It will be a different color of number on your screen. When you overpower, it gives you bonus damage based on your current life as well as your amount of fortify. So the more tanky you are and the more extra shielding you have on you when it triggers, that will go into dealing more damage. So again, for the tanky builds, you can run overpower fortify, and you can be tanky and still deal respectable damage, and in some cases, ridiculous damage. The key thing to note about this is that tick-based effects like dots will not trigger overpower, and your overpower chance cannot be directly increased by gear. You can't just get a stat of like plus 5% overpower. The most common way to cause an overpower, builds or abilities that use overpower will find ways to guarantee overpower. Like if you've been healthy for 15 seconds, you can guarantee an overpower hit. If you've been in bear form for long enough, or you've gotten enough orbs on Necromancer, you can cause overpowers to happen. So for the builds that use overpower to prevent extra damage coming in for the DPS builds, you do have to invest in the skills that give you guaranteed overpower, but everyone has a base chance to overpower, and whether you're tanky or not, it does come as free damage. And by the way, that overpower can also crit. So you can deal direct damage, you can critically strike normal damage, you can overpower a regular hit, or you can overpower crit and do even more damage, which is your crit scaling on top of your overpower hit. So that's why the overpower builds can get very strong and hit very hard. But again, this is worth its own video, so I'll make a separate video going through overpower, fortify, and all of that. But for now, just know that this exists, and it's one of the ways that you can build your character to deal damage. Next is a coined term called vulnerable, and this is just a damage amplifier. That is all it is. It just has a noun, a name that they gave it called vulnerable. They will glow purple and have purple on their health bar, but it at base is just a damage amplifier. The reason it's useful is you can have effects that trigger when you're striking a target that is vulnerable. So not only is it nice for group play and single play, marking the target to take amplified damage, but you can also have bonus effects that trigger when you hit a target that's vulnerable, like being able to stun them, immobilize them, or proc bonuses like lucky hits and things like that. It's baseline 20%. So if you have no bonuses on your character and you apply vulnerable, all that's doing is making that target take 20% more damage from all sources. And then you have other ways to build into it. You'll find plenty of builds that use vulnerable as part of their way to get stronger. So it's just something that's worth being aware of. Now, there's multiple kinds of damage scalars. There are scalars for specific kinds of damage, specific elements of damage, to specific sources of damage, and then there's a scalar for all damage. So when you go into your stats here, the next 10 of these are going to be all the different kinds that you can scale damage, and it helps them to balance so that, you know, if everything did all damage, then it would be a lot harder to make those numbers work for most of these, right? Like doing more damage to a target that's slowed shouldn't be the same amount that you do to a target that's stunned, because it's far easier to slow a target than it is to stun them. So keep in mind that that's available. But there is an all damage modifier. It's a little bit harder to get to and the numbers are smaller, but it will scale all of your damage when you do have this equipped. You also have a scalar for the global category of crowd control, which gives you a huge bonus for slows, immobilizes, stuns, knockbacks, knockdowns, taunts, fears, tethers, dazes, chills, and freeze. The fact that slow is even in here in the first place means that crowd control is a very wide category. And there are builds that really depend on this. Now, keep in mind that all of the categories that you have are not effective on bosses. However, after staggering a boss, they are considered affected by all crowd control types for their staggered duration. So mostly for world bosses and these big boss fights that take a while, they actually have a poise meter like you would have in a Souls-like game. And when you stagger them and knock them down, you'll get your bonuses from scaling that would treat it as if that boss has crowd control on them, which is super useful and gives you that bonus. You'll also notice that the abilities that are focused on crowd control, many of them have a secondary effect that will give you some kind of bonus against a boss that cannot be affected by the crowd control effects. Aside from that, there are individual scalars for all kinds of things. Damage over time of various types, bleeding, burning, poisoning, shadow. There's scalars for all of the elements in the game. There's scales for close damage, which is if an enemy is within a minimum range of you. There's scalars for distant damage. So if you hit a target that's too far away and they're outside that cutoff for close range. There's damage scalars individually for all of the crowd control categories, and that it just goes across the board. And each one of these, again, is a way for you to scale damage to targets that have this debuff or are implemented. The one thing that I'll note, because I'm not going to go through every single one of these, is that they have layers to them. So for example, burning is a fire element damage over time. There are shadow damage over time dots, and there's also shadow damage. The global category of fire applies damage to fire abilities and to fire dots. So you'll get that double up there, and it will be represented in your burning damage as well. However, if it specifically says poisoning damage over time, shadow damage over time, bleeding, which is a physical damage over time, burning, which is a fire damage over time, etc., etc., it's only for the dot portion, but some of that value comes from the category of the element that it belongs to. So just so you know that that's in the game. Next is your thorn stat. And this is effectively what you would expect it to be. It's spikes. It's like punching a cactus. When you hit a cactus, the thorns go into you and it hurts you back. So it is a reflective damage statistic. This number here can scale up. And what this means is that anytime someone deals or an enemy deals direct damage to you, it will return damage back to them. Currently, only Barbarians and Necromancers have viable Thorns builds, but it's available for all classes, and it's possible that later down the line, you get more value out of this. But Barbarian and Necromancer use this stat the best. And so what you can do is you can build full Thorn builds where you have high defense, and you just walk around and say, come at me, bro. And when they attack you, they take return damage, and you can scale that up quite a lot. Specifically, the bleed Thorn build for Barbarian is actually insanely powerful. Unlike previous Diablo games, you just have a potion button. It just gives you health and recovers health over time, and you can get bonuses and effects that happen. But the maximum number of charges that you can use before you have to collect the healing orbs that come off of enemies, go to the healing wells that are scattered about the open area and encounter spaces, or go to a healer located in a town to refresh, is specified as a defensive stat. You increase this with some stat options, but primarily by completing the campaign and unlocking more of your zone progress. That's the number one way you're going to increase this, but it means that you can have more of the potion charges. You can see right above my health orb, my little health globe there in the bottom left, that I have 5 charges right now on my Sorceress, and I can increase that by doing my zone progress activities. We already talked about armor, but let's talk about armor contribution. So the way they calculate your magical damage reduction is a combination of your armor statistic, a portion of it, and all of your resistances. So they put those two together to create your non-physical damage or magical damage reduction. So getting more armor does give you a small increase to your magical damage reduction. And then obviously that's also increased by your resistances so that you can reduce that down. So you can specify 1, so fire resistance plus a portion of your armor gives you your magical damage reduction. And of course, there's plenty of ways to get this through abilities and other effects that will reduce your magical damage taken. Next is dodge chance. This is treated differently in many games, so it's worth reviewing. In this game, it is it does count as a hit, but it deals no damage. So if you dodge an attack, you avoid all of the damage that you would take from that hit. And they went out of their way to remind you that dodge chance does have a pretty heavy DR on it, diminishing return, which means the more dodge chance you get, the less effective the less return you'll get on that. So you can't get to 100% dodge chance, but dodge chance is very effective for some classes and some builds, and there's ways to increase it throughout all of your gameplay. Then for utility, this is all your utilitarian effects. Things like your maximum resource, which is shown on the right side of your bottom middle UI and changes based on what class you are. We are a sorceress on this, so a maximum mana is what we have. You can also have maximum essence, maximum fury, so on and so forth. You also have a regeneration stat or a generation stat, depending on what class you are, which shows how much you've collected on your gear that helps you generate or regenerate more mana. Your movement speed, which is at base 100%, but you can flat increase that. You can even watch it move if you do bursts of speed and abilities, just as a way to test and see that stat go up. Cooldown reduction is also a statistic. There are abilities that will directly modify an active cooldown. Those won't show up here in this sheet, but there is a flat default cooldown reduction which you get on your gear, which for some builds might rely on that if they need even more cooldown reduction. Lucky hit chance bonus. I had made a separate video for this one that's already on my channel going over what lucky hit chance is. It's very straightforward. It is just your chance to proc, and there's a scalar value from lucky hit that will change based on the source of the application to make it fair, right? So that something that hits fast will not be more effective at proccing on average than something that hits slow. And that's why you see lucky hit chance changing all over the place. It's confusing when you look at it, but just think about it as a chance to proc and a bonus effect. And based on the vessel that carries that proc, Blizzard can balance that and change that to make it a little more fair so that it's not just only fast or frequent abilities that benefit from lucky hit. They wanted all abilities to benefit from it, or at least that's the theory. There's also 2 crowd control stats, one that's displayed here and one that's not. There's crowd control duration bonus and crowd control duration reduction. So you can actually scale the duration of the CC that you put out on enemies, and you can also reduce the duration of CC that gets applied to you. This gets treated differently in PvP, but those stats are both available. So, if you are a heavy CC style build, you can scale the duration of that to give you more windows to have combos and bonuses. And you can also reduce the crowd control so that if there's encounters, like you're an uptime kind of build and even being stunned for a couple seconds really hurts your damage output because you lose all your stacks or bonuses or resource generation, then you can run crowd control reduction so that if you get CC'd, it lasts less duration overall. And as I'm sure you know, if you've played any PvE game that has PvP, thankfully they decided to do this, but it is far, 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 far easier to balance if they separate the two so that they have individual scalars that they can use for PvP that don't affect PvE and vice versa. So these are your PvP stats on your stat board. These will go up and down depending on how they decide to balance PvP. PvP is going to be a wild, wild west for a while when we first get the game, but your PvP values of damage reduction and magical damage reduction are going to be separate stats that they can scale. They can also scale your damage output, cooldown reduction. They can scale whatever they want, but they're going to treat it as a secondary system so that, buffing PvE doesn't always buff PvP and vice versa. And that way it's a little bit more manageable for them. And that's the majority of the core stats. There are a couple more stats that are going to be very niche and specific to a build. Things like barrier generation is a stat that you can get on gear that makes you generate more barrier with barrier generating abilities. You can get fortify generation, which again, just like with barriers, it scales up your ability to generate fortify, which you can think about as just a bonus shield HP added to your character. There's healing percent received, which means you can scale the amount of healing you get from all sources. And then there's tons of class specific things. Only barbarians can go into berserk. You can scale the berserk duration and the benefits you get from berserk. You can scale up your passive resource for each of the classes. And there's plenty of buffs and bonuses that each class has that they can actually get statistics for that scale those up or down. And those are the vast majority of all the stats and bonuses in Diablo 4. Hopefully this is a good primer for you to get into the game and understand how everything works. And hopefully I cleared up some of the more murky or mysterious stats that exist in the game. If you got value out of the video, leave a like and comment down below. It helps me out tremendously, and come hang out with me on my live stream. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.